Good afternoon, classmates and Dr. Hankson. This is Tabitha Hughes, and I am going to be talking to you today about our discussion topic for this week, which is to talk about the difference between liberty and freedom as it relates to the development of Western freedom and Western civilization. Now, this was an interesting topic for me to research because prior to this, I would have basically said that liberty and freedom were synonymous, which I'm sure most people would probably say if you polled them. But after doing this research, I have found that not to be the case, that there are some subtle differences. So, the first thing I want to start off with is just the basic definition of both liberty and freedom as defined by the Oxford Dictionary. So, liberty, according to the Oxford Dictionary, is the state of being free within society from oppressive restrictions imposed by authority on one's way of life, behavior, or political views. Freedom, according to the dictionary, is the power or right to act, speak, or think as one wants. Now, at first glance, you would think, well, that's pretty much saying the same thing, but really, there are some subtle differences. Subtle, yes, but still different. So, looking in the context of that definition for both terms, and then pairing that with what we've been reading about in the last three modules, it takes you back to really the beginning of the discussion of liberty versus freedom. And that comes from the ancients with Plato and Aristotle, and how they viewed basically freedom kind of being what I define as extrinsic, it's on the outside. Whereas liberty is something intrinsic, it's on the inside. It's what governs ourselves and makes us into moral human beings that act according to our moral inclinations. Whereas freedom is kind of something placed upon us by the state. So I chose to look at some important quotes throughout various readings, and I'll tell you what they're from to kind of illustrate that. So the first is from John Milton, and he wrote in his prose works in The Second Defense of the English People, he described liberty as follows. He says, liberty is a quality of rational self-command. It's within individuals. And he says real and substantial liberty depends on sobriety of conduct and integrity of life. It was a violation of nature that one who is incapable of governing himself should be committed to the government of another. So again, Milton is kind of in that same vein of Aristotle and Plato, that liberty is intrinsic within us. And it was interesting reading Aristotle and his views of liberty, especially in relation to how he described, slavery and so forth, and then Plato expanding upon that. It was interesting to read their ideas of slavery, and that some people, if they don't have, I hate to say, dare I say, wits or intelligence about them, then they deserve to be slaves. And so, looking at that idea of liberty and being governed by ourselves intrinsically versus being governed without or from someone outside. The next person that I would like to discuss is John H. Hallowell, and he wrote in his book, The Moral Foundation of Democracy, he talked about liberty and freedom, again, being different, and freedom also being compared to license. So let me tell you what he said. He said, when life is subject to no order or personal restraint, freedom becomes a mere license to do as one pleases. Such a distinction was commonly made by the American founding fathers as well as classical liberal theorists such as John Locke. By liberty, they meant those freedoms which people ought to possess. License, by contrast, referred to those freedoms which people ought not to have and thus those freedoms which are lawfully constrained. Freedom conceived as license leads to anarchy, and anarchy manifests itself as political tyranny. So I thought that this was a really great way to see kind of that difference between liberty and freedom. Um, Again, liberty is that intrinsic peace within ourselves that allows us to govern ourselves morally and do what is right. Whereas freedom, we can, freedom I think of as this, just because we have the power to do something doesn't mean that we should. So sometimes our freedoms have to be governed by law so that we don't just exclusively act on what we want. Imagine a world where everybody just acted on everything they wanted to do with no regard for anyone around them. And so that, as I've done this research, has kind of taught me to look at liberty and freedom as different, in its subtleties, and to realize that I, as a citizen, have a responsibility to conduct myself in a moral vein, in a moral way. And so that is what gives me my liberty. Yes, there are freedoms that I have as basic rights: the right to free speech, free press, protest, those kinds of things. But there are restrictions on my freedom, and a lot of times that is to guarantee that I don't do something that would be detrimental to others around me, or to the state, or to the community as a whole. I hope you enjoyed my interpretation of this discussion on liberty versus freedom as it has been defined throughout Western civilization, if you will, in its movement towards Western freedom. Thank you.